The monastery does not appear suddenly. It reveals itself slowly through morning mist, stone walls emerging from pale grey air as if they had grown from the mountain itself. No road leads clearly to it, no sign marks its presence. It stands where the slope levels briefly before rising again into higher silence. The wind moves lightly across the roof tiles, carrying the cold breath of altitude. Nothing here suggests abandonment, nothing suggests welcome. It simply remains. Before the light reaches the inner courtyard, the bell tower stands in outline against a sky still undecided between night and morning. The bell does not ring yet. It hangs in patient stillness, suspended above stone that has absorbed decades of wind and snow. The mountain air carries a faint metallic scent mixed with damp earth. No other buildings stand nearby. The monastery does not overlook a village. It overlooks distance. Inside the monastery, the corridors remain dim even as morning gathers outside. Narrow windows allow thin strips of light to rest against stone walls, worn smooth by passing hands. The air feels cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of old wood and extinguished candles. No footsteps echo yet. The building holds its silence the way it holds its structure, evenly and without strain. In a small stone room at the far end of the corridor, the monk is already awake. He sits upright on a narrow wooden bed, hands resting loosely on his knees. The window beside him shows only pale mist moving slowly across the slope. He does not rise immediately. He waits as if listening to something beneath the wind, something that does not ask to be heard but continues nonetheless. He stands without hurry and folds the thin blanket with careful precision, aligning its edges as if the gesture itself carries weight. The stone floor beneath his feet holds the night's cold. He feels it without reaction. A small wooden table rests near the wall, bearing a single candle, a worn book and a ceramic cup. Nothing else occupies the room. Nothing else is required. He moves into the corridor, his steps soft against the stone. The air there feels slightly colder than inside his room, as if the walls themselves preserve the memory of night. Faint light now stretches across the floor in narrow bands, touching one side of the passage while leaving the other in shadow. The monastery does not echo loudly. It absorbs sound rather than returning it. He enters the small chapel, where rows of simple wooden benches face a modest altar, carved from the same stone as the walls. No ornament hangs above it. No color interrupts the muted gray of the interior. The air carries the faint scent of old wax and cooled incense. He pauses near the front, not kneeling yet, allowing the quiet to settle fully around him. He kneels slowly on the worn stone before the altar, lowering himself with deliberate control, as if the movement must align with the silence of the room. His hands rest loosely against the wooden bench in front of him. He does not begin with words. He remains still long enough for the faint sounds of wind outside to become part of the interior quiet. Light from the narrow window touches the side of his face and then shifts away. Nothing interrupts the moment. Nothing rushes it forward. He remains kneeling long after the first light has settled across the chapel floor. His breathing is steady and unforced, rising and falling without emphasis. The wooden benches behind him hold no weight other than their own. Dust particles drift slowly through the narrow beam of morning light, visible only when they pass through brightness. The silence here is not empty. It feels layered, built from stone, wind, and years of repetition that have shaped the space without altering its form. After a long while, he rises from his knees with the same measured control with which he lowered himself. The stone floor has absorbed the shape of countless mornings like this one. He turns toward the entrance of the chapel and pauses before stepping out, as if acknowledging the stillness he is leaving behind. Outside the doorway, the corridor remains dim, holding a cooler air that carries the faint scent of damp stone and mountain wind. The day has begun, though nothing announces it. He walks toward the small wooden door that opens into the inner courtyard. The latch is simple and worn smooth where his hand has touched it each morning. When he opens it, cold air enters slowly, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine. The courtyard is narrow and enclosed by high stone walls that soften the wind without blocking it entirely. The sky above appears pale and thin at this altitude, its color not yet committed to brightness. He steps into the courtyard and closes the door gently behind him. The sound of wood meeting stone is soft and brief, quickly absorbed by the surrounding walls. A small garden rests along one side, bordered by uneven stones that hold back thin soil gathered over years. The plants are modest and seasonal, growing in quiet persistence against the cold mountain air. He pauses near the center of the courtyard, feeling the wind move across his robe without resistance. At the far corner of the courtyard stands a simple wooden broom, leaning against stone that has darkened from years of moisture and shadow. He takes it in both hands and begins sweeping the ground in slow, even strokes. The sound of bristles against stone forms a quiet rhythm that blends with the wind overhead. Dust and fallen leaves gather gradually into small lines. The act does not seek to perfect the space. It maintains it, preserving order without erasing the mountain's presence. He continues sweeping along the perimeter of the courtyard, guiding the broom carefully around the edges where stone meets soil. Small fragments of dried leaves and dust gather into narrow piles that he later carries aside. The wind does not resist the motion. It moves lightly through the open space, lifting only what it chooses. The sound of the bristles remains steady and unhurried, marking time more clearly than any clock could. The courtyard does not demand cleanliness. It accepts attention. When the sweeping is finished, he rests the broom again against the stone wall and remains standing for a moment in the cleared space. The courtyard looks nearly the same as before, only slightly more defined. Light now reaches farther across the ground, touching the edges of the garden beds and the base of the surrounding walls. He lifts his gaze toward the open sky above the courtyard, where thin clouds drift slowly across pale blue. Nothing interrupts the mountain silence beyond the walls. He walks toward the small iron bell suspended beneath a simple wooden beam near the courtyard wall. The rope attached to it hangs straight and still in the morning air. He takes the rope in his hand and pauses before pulling. The mountain stretches far beyond the walls, unseen but present in the thinning air. When he draws the rope downward, the bell releases a deep, resonant tone that travels outward across stone and slope, fading slowly into distance rather than echoing back. The sound of the bell lingers longer in the air than in the ear. It seems to move across the slope, carried by wind that neither resists nor amplifies it. No other bell answers. No footsteps approach the gate. The tone dissolves gradually into the open mountain space, leaving behind a silence that feels deeper than before. He releases the rope slowly and watches it return to stillness, its fibers settling without sway. The monastery does not wait for response. It continues its rhythm regardless. He turns away from the bell and walks toward the small garden beds along the courtyard wall. The soil is thin, but carefully tended, held in place by uneven stones gathered from the mountain itself. He kneels beside the first row and presses his fingers lightly into the earth, testing its moisture without tools. The cold has not fully left the ground. It lingers beneath the surface. He begins loosening the soil with slow, patient movements that disturb only what must be moved. He moves carefully along the narrow rows, removing small weeds that have taken root between fragile stems. The plants do not grow abundantly at this altitude. They endure. Their leaves carry a muted, green-shaped more by wind than by warmth. He presses loose soil gently back around each stem, steadying what the mountain unsettles. The air passes over him in slow currents, carrying only stone and distant pine. The garden promises nothing beyond another season of quiet effort. When he finishes tending the last row, he rises slowly and brushes the remaining soil from his hands. The garden appears unchanged at first glance, yet subtly ordered beneath quiet attention. Light now rests fully inside the courtyard, warming the upper stones while the lower walls remain cool to the touch. He stands for a moment beside the narrow beds, not evaluating the work, only observing the way morning settles into the space without resistance. He returns the small hand tool to its place beside the wall and steps back into the corridor. The shift from open air to enclosed stone feels immediate, as if the building holds a different measure of time. Light enters through narrow windows in thin, pale lines, touching the floor without warming it. His steps remain soft and unhurried. The monastery does not echo loudly. It absorbs movement and allows it to fade without trace. He walks toward the small kitchen at the end of the corridor, where a narrow window faces the slope beyond the monastery walls. The room is simple, defined by stone, wood, and a small iron stove set against the far corner. A clay jar rests on the table beside a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. He opens the stove door and feeds it a small piece of wood, watching the faint flame grow without urgency. The morning does not require haste. It requires presence. He fills a small kettle with water from a clay container and places it over the low flame. The metal warms slowly, releasing a faint, steady sound as heat gathers beneath it. He slices a thin piece of bread and sets it on a wooden plate without ceremony. Nothing in the room feels excessive. The narrow window admits a pale wash of light that rests on the table's surface and then retreats as clouds drift across the mountain sky. He waits beside the stove as the water begins to tremble lightly inside the kettle. The sound is soft, almost hidden beneath the distant wind moving across the monastery walls. Steam rises in a thin line, dissolving quickly in the cool air of the kitchen. He pours the water into a simple cup and stands still for a moment, holding it between both hands. The warmth travels slowly through his fingers, steady and contained. He eats standing near the narrow window, breaking the bread into small pieces and chewing slowly. The mountain beyond the glass remains partially veiled in mist, its outline soft and distant. No path is visible from this height. No movement crosses the slope. The monastery does not overlook a village or a road. It overlooks space. He finishes the bread without reflection and sets the empty plate back on the table. The meal does not divide the day. It sustains it. After rinsing the cup and plate with a small measure of water, he dries them with a worn cloth and returns them to their place on the shelf. The kitchen resumes its quiet order, unchanged by the brief movement. The flame inside the stove lowers gradually as he closes the iron door. He does not rush to extinguish it completely. The warmth lingers, soft and contained, within stone that has held many mornings like this one. He leaves the kitchen and walks along the corridor toward a small room lined with wooden shelves. The air inside carries the faint scent of old paper and dust, warmed by thin sunlight. Books rest upright in careful order, their covers worn smooth by years of use. He runs his fingers lightly along the spine of one volume before selecting it. The gesture is unhurried, as if the choice does not matter, only the act of reading itself. He carries the book to a narrow bench beneath the window and sits down slowly. Light falls across the open pages in a pale rectangle, bright enough to reveal the texture of paper without softening the room's cool air. He begins reading without moving his lips, eyes traveling steadily from one line to the next. The wind outside shifts slightly in tone, but the monastery holds its interior quiet, intact. He turns each page with deliberate care, lifting the thin paper between his fingers as if it might tear under haste. The words do not rush him forward. They unfold in measured lines that mirror the rhythm of his breathing. Dust drifts quietly in the band of light near the window, visible only for a moment before fading into shadow. Beyond the glass, clouds move slowly across the mountain, changing nothing within the room. After some time, he closes the book gently and rests his hand on its cover without rising. The silence that follows does not feel different from the silence before reading. It feels continuous, as if the pages had only deepened what was already present. Light has shifted slightly across the floor, marking the slow passage of the sun. He remains seated for a moment longer, neither reflecting nor anticipating the next task. He rises from the bench and returns the book to its place among the others, sliding it carefully between two worn volumes. The shelves do not sag. They hold their weight evenly, as they have for years. He pauses briefly, fingers resting against the wood, then turns toward the corridor. The monastery remains still, its walls carrying the steady coolness of stone untouched by hurry. He walks slowly down the corridor toward the far end of the monastery, where a narrow doorway opens to a small exterior terrace. The stone beneath his feet remains cool despite the rising sun. Light enters in angled strips, touching only parts of the wall while leaving others in shadow. Nothing inside the building suggests movement beyond his own. The air feels thinner here, carrying the mountain's quiet breath through every opening. He steps onto the terrace and pauses near the low stone wall that borders the edge. From here, the mountain slope descends in long, uneven stretches before dissolving into mist. The sky above appears wider than it did in the courtyard, uninterrupted by walls. Wind moves steadily across the open space, brushing against his robe without force. He rests his hands lightly on the stone and looks outward, not searching for anything, only acknowledging the distance. He remains on the terrace longer than the moment requires. The wind shifts slightly, carrying a faint chill that lingers against his face. Below, the slope shows no path, only rock and sparse grass shaped by altitude. The monastery walls behind him feel solid and unmoving. He does not lean forward or step closer to the edge. He stands where he is, allowing the horizon to remain distant and undefined. After a while, he turns and walks back inside, closing the terrace door gently behind him. The corridor receives him with its familiar coolness. Light has shifted again, stretching farther along the stone floor. The monastery does not react to his return. It holds its quiet evenly, as if each movement within it leaves no trace beyond the brief sound of footsteps fading into stillness. He enters the chapel once more, not for ritual now, but for maintenance. A thin layer of dust has settled along the edges of the benches and the base of the altar. He takes a small cloth from a nearby shelf and begins wiping the wood in slow, steady strokes. The motion is quiet and unhurried. Sunlight filters through the narrow window, revealing the fine particles he lifts into the air before they settle again. He moves from bench to bench with the same careful rhythm, pressing the cloth into the worn grain of the wood. The altar remains simple and unadorned, its surface cool beneath his hand. Dust gathers faintly along the edges, never entirely absent, never fully removed. The chapel does not demand perfection. It accepts repetition. Outside, the wind continues its steady passage along the stone walls, unheard but present. When he finishes wiping the last bench, he folds the cloth carefully and places it back on the shelf. The chapel returns to its quiet order, unchanged in structure, only slightly altered in texture. Light now reaches deeper across the floor, touching the base of the altar before retreating again behind a passing cloud. He stands still for a moment, not evaluating the work, only inhabiting the stillness it reveals. He steps outside the chapel and closes the door softly, allowing the faint scent of wax and wood to remain within. The corridor stretches ahead in narrow perspective, its stone walls carrying subtle variations of grey, shaped by years of weather. A draught moves lightly along the floor, barely noticeable except where it touches the edge of his robe. He walks toward the central courtyard again, following the same path traced each morning without deviation. The courtyard rests beneath a brighter sky now, though the air remains cool. He crosses the open space without haste, glancing briefly at the garden beds he tended earlier. Nothing dramatic has changed. Leaves hold the same muted green. Soil remains dark and compact. He pauses near the center, feeling the mountain wind move around the enclosed walls before slipping upward and away. He walks toward a small wooden shed at the edge of the courtyard, where tools are kept in simple order. Inside, the scent of dry wood and iron lingers in the cool air. He selects a narrow-handled rake and returns to the garden beds. The movement is measured, neither hurried nor delayed. The monastery does not track time by clocks. It measures it through repetition and the steady completion of small tasks. He draws the rake lightly across the soil, breaking the surface just enough to let air pass through. The metal teeth leave faint lines that will soften again with the next wind. He moves slowly from one row to the next, keeping the pressure even. The sound is subtle, a low scrape against earth that blends with the distant current of air moving along the mountain face. When the soil has been turned lightly across each row, he rests the rake against the low stone border and kneels to press the earth gently with his hands. The surface yields slightly beneath his touch. He does not shape it into symmetry. He only steadies what has been loosened. The wind passes overhead without entering the courtyard fully, brushing the upper walls and continuing toward the slope beyond. He rises slowly and carries the rake back to the shed, placing it in the same position from which he took it. The tools hang evenly along the wall, their handles worn smooth by long use. Nothing inside the shed appears unused. Nothing appears new. He closes the small wooden door and returns to the courtyard, where light has begun to soften again as clouds gather across the sky. He remains standing in the courtyard as the light shifts almost imperceptibly above the high walls. Clouds drift slowly across the mountain sky, thinning the brightness without darkening the day. The stone beneath his feet holds a tempered warmth now, neither cold nor inviting. He does not hurry back inside. He lets the moment extend, as if the courtyard itself requires a witness to its stillness. The monastery does not expand or contract with weather. It endures within it. He walks toward the far wall of the courtyard, where a narrow stone basin collects rainwater from the sloped roof above. The surface of the water remains still, reflecting a fragment of sky framed by rough edges. He dips a small metal cup into it and pours the water slowly at the base of the nearest plants. The motion is careful and unexaggerated. The soil darkens slightly where moisture settles. Nothing here grows quickly. Everything grows in patience. He continues carrying small measures of water from the basin to each narrow bed, never spilling more than necessary. The cup moves steadily from stone to soil and back again, tracing a simple arc through the air. The scent of damp earth rises faintly, blending with the dry breath of altitude. Overhead, the sky remains pale and unsettled, clouds passing without casting heavy shadow. The garden absorbs what it receives without response. When the basin is nearly empty, he sets the cup down and wipes his hands against the fabric of his robe. A thin film of moisture remains on his skin, cooling quickly in the mountain air. The courtyard appears unchanged at first glance, yet the soil holds a darker tone that will fade by afternoon. He does not linger to observe the effect. The work is complete when the motion stops. He returns once more to the center of the courtyard and looks upward. The sky has opened slightly, revealing a clearer blue between passing clouds. Light falls more directly now, touching the upper stones and tracing their uneven edges. The wind has softened, though it has not disappeared. It never disappears entirely at this height. He closes his eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in quiet acknowledgement of the air moving across his face. He walks back inside and closes the courtyard door with a measured hand. The shift from open sky to enclosed stone feels gradual rather than abrupt. The corridor receives him with its familiar coolness and dim light. Shadows rest along the base of the walls, deepening where the floor curves slightly toward the center. His footsteps remain soft, absorbed quickly by the monastery's steady silence. He enters his small room and pauses near the window, where light now reaches fully across the narrow sill. The mist has thinned, revealing more of the slope below, though no path appears. He adjusts the simple wooden chair slightly, aligning it with the table as if the angle matters. The room remains spare and deliberate, shaped by necessity rather than preference. He sits for a moment without opening the book beside him. He rests his hands flat on the table and lowers his gaze to the worn surface of the wood. Small marks and shallow cuts trace patterns formed by years of quiet use. Nothing in the room carries decoration. Nothing suggests change. Outside the window, a thin current of wind brushes along the stone wall and continues down the slope. He remains seated without reading, allowing the stillness to settle fully before rising again. After a while, he stands and walks toward the narrow staircase that leads to the upper level of the monastery. The steps are carved from stone, slightly uneven at their edges. He places each foot carefully, accustomed to their irregular rhythm. Light from a small window above casts a pale shape along the wall, shifting gradually as clouds move. The air grows cooler as he ascends, carrying a faint trace of wind that slips through unseen cracks. At the top of the staircase, a small attic chamber opens beneath the sloped roof. The ceiling beams are darkened by time, their surfaces marked by years of cold seasons and quiet summers. He crosses the room slowly, running his hand along the wood as if confirming its steadiness. A narrow window looks out toward higher peaks, their outlines faint beneath drifting cloud. He stands there for a moment, neither measuring the distance nor seeking clarity. He opens the small window just enough to let the mountain air pass through the chamber. The wind enters in a thin current, carrying the scent of stone and distant pine. The curtain lifts slightly, then settles again. From this height, the monastery feels anchored rather than elevated, held firmly against the slope. He does not remain long. The air is colder here, and the silence feels broader, less contained by walls. He closes the window gently and descends the staircase with the same measured care. Each step echoes faintly before dissolving into the thick stone walls. The corridor below feels warmer by comparison, though the difference is slight. Light has shifted again, narrowing its reach along the floor. The monastery does not mark the hour with sound. It allows the sun to draw quiet lines across its surfaces instead. He walks toward the far end of the corridor, where a narrow door opens to a small storage room. Inside, sacks of grain and jars of preserved vegetables rest in careful rows along the wall. The air smells faintly of dried herbs and cool earth. He checks each container without opening them fully, pressing lightly against the lids to confirm their seal. Nothing appears disturbed. Nothing suggests shortage. He lingers a moment in the storage room, letting his eyes move slowly across the shelves. The jars catch a thin thread of light from the corridor, reflecting dull shapes without brightness. He adjusts one sack slightly, so it rests evenly against the wall, then steps back. The room holds no excess. It contains only what is necessary for the coming weeks, arranged without urgency or fear of depletion. He closes the storage door and returns to the corridor, where the air feels lighter and less enclosed. A faint draft moves along the floor, brushing past his sandals before disappearing into the chapel doorway. The monastery remains quiet, yet not inactive. Its stillness is shaped by movement that leaves no lasting trace. He pauses briefly at the center of the hall, listening to the wind press gently against the outer walls. He steps once more into the courtyard, as afternoon begins to settle more fully over the mountain. The light has grown softer, losing the sharp clarity of midday. Shadows stretch slightly along the base of the walls, lengthening without drama. The garden rests undisturbed, its leaves barely shifting in the quieter air. He walks slowly across the open space, not inspecting, only passing through. The monastery holds the day evenly, neither resisting nor embracing its descent. He sits on a low stone step along the courtyard wall and allows the afternoon to continue without interruption. The mountain sky has taken on a muted tone, pale blue thinning toward grey at its edges. Wind moves more gently now, brushing the upper tiles and slipping away across the slope. He rests his hands loosely on his knees, watching the light fade in small increments that reveal no clear boundary between hours. After some time, he rises and walks slowly along the inner perimeter of the courtyard, tracing the same path he has followed countless afternoons before. The stone beneath his feet feels warmer where the sun has lingered, and cooler where shadows have already settled. He pauses near the garden once more, not to tend it, but to observe the way light rests briefly on the leaves before withdrawing. The monastery does not alter its pace as evening approaches. He returns inside as the air begins to cool again, closing the courtyard door with quiet precision. The corridor feels dimmer now, its light softened by gathering clouds. He walks toward the chapel without urgency, his steps measured and even. The monastery's interior holds a different weight in the late afternoon, as if the stone absorbs the day's fading warmth and stores it without display. He enters the chapel and pauses near the altar once more. He lights a single candle on the altar, shielding the flame briefly with his hand as it steadies. The small glow does not brighten the room fully. It softens it. Shadows gather more gently along the walls, shifting with each slight movement of air. He does not kneel this time. He stands quietly before the flame, allowing the thin light to occupy the space without ceremony. Outside, the wind changes direction, touching the chapel walls with a lower tone. He watches the candle burn for several moments, the flame bending slightly whenever a draught slips beneath the chapel door. Wax begins to soften and gather along the base, forming a quiet pool that will harden again by morning. The light does not reach the far corners of the room. It remains close to the altar, contained and deliberate. He turns away without extinguishing it, leaving the small glow to persist within the deepening afternoon. He steps back into the corridor, where shadows now stretch longer along the stone floor. The air feels cooler, touched by the first suggestion of evening. Through a narrow window, the mountain appears dimmer, its outline softened by gathering mist. He walks slowly toward the kitchen once more, aware that the day has shifted into its final hours without any clear dividing line. The monastery does not hurry this transition, it allows it to unfold gradually. In the kitchen, he rekindles the small flame inside the iron stove, adding a thin piece of wood and waiting as it catches. The room warms slightly, though the stone walls hold their cool depth. He measures a modest portion of grain into a pot and pours water over it without excess. The movements are familiar, nearly identical to those of every evening before. Outside, the wind brushes along the outer walls in longer, steadier currents. He stirs the pot slowly as the grain begins to soften, watching the surface shift with small movements of heat. Steam rises in a faint column and dissolves quickly in the cooling air of the room. He does not taste the food yet. He waits for the texture to change, listening to the subtle sound of simmering that blends with the wind beyond the walls. The light through the window has grown thinner, fading toward a muted grey. When the grain has thickened, he removes the pot from the flame and sets it on the wooden table. He eats slowly, lifting each small portion without distraction. The room is dimmer now, lit only by the fading light through the window and the low glow from the stove. He does not hurry to finish. The meal does not signal closure. It accompanies the steady descent of the day toward evening. After finishing, he rinses the pot and spoon with measured care, using only a small amount of water. He dries them and returns them to their place beside the stove. The flame is allowed to fade gradually, rather than being extinguished at once. The kitchen settles back into its restrained quiet. Outside, the mountain darkens in subtle layers, and the wind carries a colder tone that presses lightly against the monastery walls. He leaves the kitchen and walks slowly toward the bell in the courtyard once more. The sky above has shifted to a deeper grey, holding the last light of day without brightness. The courtyard feels narrower in the dimness, its walls rising more distinctly against the fading sky. He stands beneath the wooden beam and takes the rope in his hand again, pausing as if to measure the silence before breaking it. He pulls the rope with steady force, and the bell releases a deep, measured tone that spreads across the courtyard and rises into the dimming sky. The sound lingers briefly before dissolving into open mountain air. No second bell answers. No movement follows the echo. He keeps his hand on the rope for a moment, then releases it gently. The fibers settle without sway. The monastery marks the hour without expecting a response. The sound fades into the mountain without echo. Evening settles more fully across the courtyard, softening edges and deepening the spaces between stone. He releases the rope and watches it return to stillness, its fibers hanging straight in the cooling air. The sky above shifts toward a muted blue-gray, holding the last trace of light without warmth. He does not remain beneath the bell. He turns slowly and walks back toward the chapel. He enters the chapel again as evening deepens, the single candle still burning near the altar. Its flame appears brighter now against the gathering dimness, though it casts only a modest circle of light. The benches remain empty, their surfaces cooled by the descending air. He walks to the front and stands quietly, not kneeling, allowing the fading daylight to withdraw completely from the narrow window behind him. He lowers himself onto one of the front benches and rests his hands loosely in his lap. The chapel holds a thicker silence now, shaped by shadow rather than light. The candle flame bends slightly whenever a draught passes beneath the door. Outside, the mountain has lost its outline, merging into a uniform dark beyond the walls. He remains seated without movement, allowing the small flame to define the room without enlarging it. After a long stillness, he rises and moves toward the altar. With careful fingers, he cups the flame and gently extinguishes it, leaving a thin thread of smoke that curls upward before dissolving into shadow. The chapel darkens immediately, its shapes soft and indistinct. He stands for a moment in the dim interior, allowing his eyes to adjust to the absence of light before turning toward the corridor once more. He steps into the corridor where night has begun to settle fully inside the monastery. The narrow windows now reflect only faint traces of the sky, offering little illumination. He walks slowly toward his room, his footsteps nearly silent against the stone floor. The building feels heavier in darkness, not oppressive but grounded, as if the weight of the mountain presses gently against every wall. Inside his room, he lights a small oil lamp and sets it on the table beside the bed. The glow is warm but contained, illuminating only the immediate surfaces of wood and stone. Shadows gather softly along the corners, shifting when the flame trembles. He removes his outer robe and folds it carefully over the back of the chair, smoothing the fabric as if closing the day within it. He sits on the edge of the bed and removes his sandals, placing them neatly beside the wall. The stone floor feels colder now, having released the last warmth of daylight. The lamp flame remains steady, its light tracing quiet patterns along the ceiling beams. He does not read or write. He allows the room to settle around him, listening to the faint wind brushing along the outer stones of the monastery. He lies down slowly on the narrow bed and pulls the thin blanket over himself. The lamp continues burning for a few moments longer, casting a soft halo that barely reaches the far wall. Outside, the mountain wind moves in steady currents, never fully silent at this height. He watches the flame until his breathing grows slower, then reaches toward the lamp and lowers the wick, letting darkness settle evenly across the room. Night deepens around the monastery, pressing softly against its walls without urgency. Inside his room, darkness settles fully once the lamp is lowered. Only a faint trace of starlight enters through the narrow window, barely enough to define the edge of the table. He lies still, listening to the wind move across the roof tiles and down the slope beyond. The building does not shift. It holds its place against the mountain, unmoved by the dark. Hours pass without announcement. The wind changes tone once or twice, rising slightly before returning to its steady current. Clouds move across the sky beyond sight, thinning and gathering without consequence. Within the monastery, nothing stirs. The chapel remains dark. The courtyard rests beneath open night. He sleeps without turning, his breathing slow and even, aligned with the quiet rhythm of the mountain around him. Before dawn, the darkness begins to thin almost imperceptibly. The sky shifts from deep black to a muted charcoal, revealing the faint outline of the mountain beyond the window. He wakes without alarm, opening his eyes as if responding to a subtle change in air rather than to time itself. The room remains cold, its surfaces still holding the night. He lies still for a moment longer, listening to the wind soften as morning approaches. He rises slowly from the bed and folds the blanket, with the same careful precision as the morning before. The air in the room feels thinner at this hour, touched by the final breath of night. He lights the small lamp briefly, not for warmth, but to steady the transition from darkness to day. The flame burns low and quiet, its glow restrained against the pale light now forming beyond the window. He extinguishes the lamp and steps into the corridor, where early light has begun to press faintly against the narrow windows. The stone floor feels colder beneath his feet, yet familiar in its firmness. No sound marks the arrival of morning beyond the subtle shift in air and color. He walks toward the chapel again, following the same path traced the day before, without variation. He enters the chapel as the first thin light reaches the base of the altar. The room remains mostly dim, its shapes defined more by memory than sight. He kneels slowly on the stone floor, lowering himself with deliberate care. No words are spoken. The silence holds steady around him, shaped by stone and years of repetition. Beyond the walls, the mountain brightens gradually, unseen but present in the changing air. He remains kneeling as light gathers along the floor, tracing a pale line toward the benches behind him. The air in the chapel feels still, though the wind continues beyond the walls. His breathing remains slow and steady, rising and falling without emphasis. Nothing in the room suggests urgency or expectation. Morning does not arrive suddenly here. It unfolds in small increments that reshape the shadows without disturbing the quiet. After a long stillness, He rises and stands before the altar. The light now touches the edge of the stone surface, revealing its uneven texture. He does not light a candle yet. He allows the growing brightness of morning to define the room on its own. Outside, the sky shifts toward a clearer tone, thinning the last trace of night. The monastery does not awaken abruptly. It resumes. He steps out into the courtyard as the sun rises higher behind the mountain ridge. The sky holds a pale clarity, unmarked by dramatic color. The garden beds remain quiet beneath the cool air, their leaves still carrying the moisture of night. He stands near the center of the open space and listens. No footsteps approach the gate, no distant voices reach the walls. The monastery continues without audience. He walks toward the bell once more, the rope hanging motionless beneath the wooden beam. Morning light rests lightly on the metal surface, revealing faint marks left by years of touch. He does not pull it immediately. He stands beneath it, listening to the quiet that stretches beyond the walls. The mountain air feels clearer now, carrying the first warmth of day without promise of change. He draws the rope slowly, and the bell answers with a calm, resonant tone that moves outward across the courtyard and beyond the monastery walls. The sound travels into open space and fades without reply. He releases the rope gently and watches it return to stillness. The morning does not shift in response. The mountain remains as it is, holding the monastery in quiet balance. He lowers his hand from the rope and steps back, allowing the final vibration to dissolve completely into the air. The courtyard remains unchanged, its stone surfaces warming slowly beneath the rising sun. A faint breeze moves across the open space, lifting the edge of his robe before settling again. He turns toward the chapel without haste, following the same measured path traced countless mornings before. He crosses the courtyard and pauses near the garden beds, noticing the faint sheen of moisture still resting on a few leaves. The light has grown clearer now, revealing subtle textures in the stone walls and the uneven ground beneath his feet. He does not kneel to tend the soil again. He only observes the way the morning settles evenly across every surface. Nothing signals change. The monastery continues its quiet rhythm. He walks slowly along the courtyard wall, tracing its length with his eyes as if measuring its presence rather than its size. The stone bears faint marks from seasons of snow and wind, yet it stands without fracture. The sky above has cleared further, revealing a steady blue that carries no dramatic shift. He pauses near the door that leads back inside, resting his hand briefly on the wood before entering once more. He steps into the corridor again, where morning light now stretches farther along the floor than it did the day before. The air feels slightly warmer, though the stone walls retain their cool depth. He walks toward his small room without altering his pace. Nothing within the monastery suggests novelty. Each surface appears as it was, shaped by use rather than by time's visible passage. He enters his room and opens the narrow window a little wider than before. Fresh air moves inside, carrying the clean scent of stone warmed by early sun. The curtain shifts gently, then settles against the wall. From this angle, the mountain slope appears clearer, its uneven lines revealed in pale detail. He stands there without leaning out, allowing the light to fill the space gradually. He closes the window gently and turns back toward the center of the room. The light remains resting across the table and the edge of the bed. He adjusts the chair once more, aligning it carefully beneath the window, as if restoring a quiet order that never truly shifted. The room feels neither fuller nor emptier than before. It simply receives the morning as it did yesterday. He steps back into the corridor and walks toward the courtyard door once more. The monastery feels awake now, though nothing within it has changed shape or sound. Light fills the open space beyond the doorway, touching stone and soil evenly. He pauses at the threshold, neither entering nor retreating, as if acknowledging the quiet balance between interior shadow and open sky. He steps into the courtyard again and stands beneath the open sky. The garden remains modest, the walls unchanged, the bell still. The mountain stretches outward in silent repetition, neither advancing nor receding. He does not search the horizon for movement. He allows the air to move around him, steady and unremarkable. The monastery continues, not because it must prove endurance, but because it exists in quiet alignment with the slope that holds it. Nothing concludes. The bell will sound again. The garden will require tending. The corridor will hold the same cool air at dusk. Morning will thin the darkness without spectacle. The monastery does not wait for change, nor does it resist it. It remains where stone meets sky, shaped by repetition rather than by events. And the man within its walls will continue rising, walking, tending, and resting, without announcement, as the mountain keeps its quiet watch. If you would like to return to places like this, subscribe